Shalom, good morning. Shalom. Thank you. Okay, there's two rules of engagement when I talk, when I speak to people. One is that you've got to smile at me. Yeah, and if you're not smiling at me, I'm going to look at you and smile at you until you do. All right? The other is that, and this is the more important one, that whatever you hear from me this morning, I don't want you to hear anything from me, to be quite frank. My heart is that you would hear from the King today. The one you were singing to. The King, our King, who's preparing to return to this planet, who's getting ready to come back to the land, to the city that he left 2,000 years ago. What is he saying to us as he prepares to come? What he's saying to you individually is between you and him. He knows your hearts, he knows your personal circumstances. I trust that everyone here has an intimate relationship with him, and you are walking with him, and you are growing in the knowledge of him. What I'm here to speak about this morning is perhaps more what he has to say to you as a collective, as a group of Australians, as Aussies in this land of yours, which is about as far away from Israel as you can get on the planet. Before I say anything further, I want to read three passages from the Bible. Although perhaps just a quick couple of lines of introduction. I'm a journalist by training and I'm a tour guide. Before that, I'm a high school dropout. Full disclosure, I do not have a degree in theology. I've never studied at seminary. You're not going to hear this morning from a man who has spent years wearing a dog collar. I'm not a preacher, and I'm not a certified theologian. I'm a son of God, as you are, and daughters. The Holy Spirit is our teacher. There's one basic source of knowledge for all of us, unshakable truth, and that's contained between the covers of this book. You know what this book is? The Bible. My Bible begins in Genesis and ends in Revelation. No part of my Bible is old. No part of my Bible is old. Jesus never read the New Testament. Really? Yep. And God nowhere in the pages of this book are we told to refer to the Bible that Jesus spoke of as his word, as his Father's word, as the truth, or are we told to refer to it as old? And so I shan't this morning. I'm going to simply be reading from the Bible, his word. I'm going to read three passages. One has to do with the greatest event of our time, and that is the physical restoration of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. Number two has to do with our nation's responses to that, how are our nations relating to the fact that the Jewish people are back in their land, and how does God feel about the way our nations deal with them, with Israel. And number three is, at the heart of the land of Israel is a city called Jerusalem. God has some very specific words to say about that city. It has a prophetic purpose. It has a prophetic past, which is today, of course, historic, but it has a prophetic and profound purpose. Not least, the purpose being that it is the place where the throne of the Son of David will be established. Our King is coming to that city, which for the last 30 years has been my hometown. Let me just read a few verses relating to his restoration of his people to their land. This is from Amos chapter 9. Beginning of verse 11, God says, "On that day I will raise up the tabernacle of David, which has fallen down, and repair its damages. I will raise up its ruins and rebuild it as in the days of old." And from verse 14, "I will bring back the captives of my people Israel. They shall build the waste cities and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and drink wine from them. They shall also make gardens and eat fruit from them. I will plant them in their land, and no longer shall they be pulled up from the land I have given them, says the Lord, your God. Another verse which flows directly on with that is from Jeremiah 32, where God says, Behold, I will gather out of all countries where I have driven them in my anger, in my fury, and in great wrath. I will bring them back to this place, and I will cause them to dwell safely. Safely. They shall be my God, and I will be their people. Then I will give them one heart and one way, that they may fear me forever, for the good of them and their children after them. And I will make an everlasting covenant with them, that I will not turn away from doing them good. But I will put my fear in their hearts, so that they will not depart from me. Yes, I will rejoice over them. Yes, I will rejoice over them, to do them good. And I will assuredly plant them in their land with all of my heart and with all of my soul. It's the only thing in the entire Bible, by the way, that God says he will do with all of his heart and with all of his soul. Plant his ancient people back in their land. How will the nations respond to this? How have the nations responded to this? By ganging up on God. They have. By ganging up on God, the nations where the Jewish people wandered for 2,000 years, the nations that hated them, persecuted them, tried to destroy them wherever they went, the nations which preceding their dispersion among the Gentiles, those nations to which the gospel went out into, those nations who received their gospel, their Bible, their Jesus from that people, from those people, from that nation. In those nations, the Jews were hated and still are, targeted for destruction repeatedly until barely any were left. And if God had not stepped in, they would have all been done away with. That's something that Jesus spoke about prophetically, and it's something that history has shown to have been truth. He gathered them back from those nations, and beginning in 1882, he began to bring them home. And they have come from 120 different countries, and they are back in their land. And 71 years ago, this incredible miracle happened out of the darkest moment in 2,000 years of dark moments. Out of the Holocaust, they came back home. And it wasn't an easy return when they landed, still skinny from the deprivation, the starvation that they had experienced in the camps of Dachau and Auschwitz. They were given rifles and told, we got to fight for our land. Without any training, they went to war, and having survived Hitler's Holocaust, they perished on the battlefields of their new homeland, the state of Israel. For 71 years, they have strived, and God has brought life, and God has brought hope, and God has brought resurrection of the nation and of the land. And how many of you have been there? All right, what's wrong with the rest of you? For those of you who were there 5 years ago, you wouldn't recognize Israel today. No exaggeration, the country is exploding with growth. It has such a bright future ahead of it, and it is surrounded by so much animosity, not only in the Arab world, but in the widest world as well. Israel is condemned and criticized almost every week in some part of the world. How does God feel about the nations and how they relate to the Jewish people and to the land of Israel? He says these words in Joel chapter 3 very strongly. He says, for behold, in those days and at that time, what days? The very days I was just reading about, when I bring back the captives of Judah and Jerusalem, then at that time, which means at this time, I will gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, and I will enter into judgment with them there on account of my people, my heritage Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations. They have also divided up my land. I'm not going to be speaking this morning about how nations feel about the land of Israel, particularly. It's been decades and decades in which the world has been caught up in this ostensible effort to bring peace to the Middle East, but ultimately its objective has been to reverse the restoration of the Jewish people to their land, the land God gave them back, using, among others, by the way, your country, 102 years ago now, at the forefront of that liberation of the land from nearly 700 years of Islamic control, the 800 light horsemen that charged at Beersheba, and the charge a year later at Semach on the Sea of Galilee drove those Islamic authorities out of the land just as the Jewish people began coming home. In response to that, the mayor of the city of Beersheba said to your ambassador a few years ago, David Sharma, he said, if it was not for Australia, there would be no Israel. And if you don't know the history of the relationship between your land and Israel, you're missing out on one of the most incredible components in your national history. I would say the most important one of all. You should know. You know, when God looks at the world, he doesn't see Jews, Americans, Australians, South Africans, Chinese. He looks at the world and he sees Israel and he sees the nations. And every single nation is related to by God and dealt with by God in response to the way they relate to what he calls the apple of his eye. Get this. Get it good. Israel is the apple of God's eye. That means when God looks at the planet. Remember when they were coming out of the wilderness, and Moses said to them, the land you're going into is not like the land of Egypt, out of which you have come. The land you're going into is a land for which the Lord your God cares. His eyes are on that land from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. And you want to say, yeah, well, his eyes are on everything from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. Yeah, they're on Australia. Yes, they are. His eyes are on everything. He sees everything. But he singles out this little slip of land that can fit 5 times into Tasmania, a tiny little land. And he says, I'm watching that land day and night, every single day of the year. If it's the apple of his eye, the nation and the land, and you cannot separate them, then it is the very center of God's view. Our God. Your God. If it's not the center of your view, if Israel is not at the very center of your view, you are squint. You're not looking through the same eyes that God is looking at when he looks at our planet. Look at this book. This book has a few pages that are not about Israel. That's Genesis 1 to 11. The rest of this book is all about Israel. Get that. Our Bible, the Word of God, which he prefers above his own name, is focused on one nation and one land, which was at the center of the plan of redemption when he called out Abram and he said, go there. And just chill, those of you starting to get a bit antsy already. I know the Bible doesn't say, for God so loved Israel that he sent his only begotten son. It says, for God so loved the world. And when he called out Abram, he said, Abram, I'm calling you out to bless all the nations of the world. But God's choice was to use a nation, and that Jesus would have a country and would have a nationality, that Jesus would be Jewish from the... At what point does Jesus become Jewish? Well, that's a theological question we could have later. But did he ever lose his Jewishness? Will he ever lose his Jewish identity? Never. Never. He will always be the Lion of that tribe. It's his name, one of his many names. The whole world is stacking up against Israel, and we can read in many places about the future when the nations of the world come against Israel. When they do come against Israel, they're not coming against the land itself so specifically, as they are going to be drawn around a city called Jerusalem. God's going to gather them there. He's going to bring them into that battlefield, and that's what it's going to be. About Jerusalem, God says, this is Zechariah chapter 12, behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of drunkenness to all the surrounding peoples when they lay siege against Judah and Jerusalem, and in that day it shall happen that I will make Jerusalem a very heavy stone for all peoples. All who would heave it away will surely be cut in pieces, though all nations of the earth are gathered against it. Just jumping forward a little bit. In that day I will make the governors of Judah like a firepan in the woodpile and like a fiery torch in the sheaves. They shall devour all the surrounding peoples on the right hand and on the left. But Jerusalem shall be inhabited again in her own place, Jerusalem. In that day, the Lord will defend the inhabitants of Jerusalem. The one who is feeble among them in that day shall be like David, and the house of David shall be like God, like the angel of the Lord before them. It shall be in that day that I will seek to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem, and I will pour out on them, on the house of David, my spirit of grace and supplication. God speaks about a future destiny for the city of Jerusalem. The pinnacle of that destiny is the return of the king to that city. Jerusalem is the city of the great king in both the first part of our Bible and the second part of our Bible. It's its identity. He left there, he will return there. When he came down the mountain on the donkey, everyone there thought he was coming to be king, but he wasn't. He was coming to die. He's coming back to be king. When he comes back to be king, well, he is king already, but when he comes back to sit on his throne, he's not coming. I know we have in these Bible story illustrations, we see Jesus coming through the cloud on his white stallion, right? And around him are people blowing shofars and waving banners, and it's all like very Christian. Jesus isn't coming back like that. And I'm smiling on that side of my face, but I'll drop my smile right now because Jesus is coming back for war. He's coming back for war. He's coming back furious with our nations. Furious with our nations. And he is going to deal with them very specifically, not because of the national immorality that is expanding and bringing our nations increasingly into darkness. Not because of the sanctity of life battles that we are fighting, or the sanctity of marriage. He's coming to deal with the nations as nations because of the way they have related to that nation and to that city, the city of Jerusalem. I hope you know the background of Anzac history in the Middle East. If you don't know that, please find time to learn. Learn about the sacrifices, which I know you know about. You know sacrifices were made, but learn about the sacrifices that were made in the context of the restoration of the people of Israel to their land in order, as Charles Haddon Spurgeon said, back in the 19th century already, he said, the Jewish people will be gathered back to their land. They will become a political entity, a state, and then they will become a kingdom. Geopolitical developments like World War I, World War II, and the Holocaust, which was not the last, not the final, but one of the most recent and most extensive efforts of Satan to annihilate that nation. The Gulf Wars, the current escalation of tension in the Middle East that has a standoff developing between the United States and Israel and the United States allies on one hand and Iran on the other. In the last 48 hours, I don't know if you're following, you maybe want to keep your dial tuned to that story that's developing there. The threat this morning that was published in the Jerusalem Post, interviews with members of an organization called the Hezbollah, which is an Iranian-backed organization in Lebanon, which is aiming 150,000 missiles at Israel, and said in this interview this morning, we're waiting to strike, and we will strike the first blow this time. Israel's on the edge of war and has been since its creation, its recreation. But those are geopolitical events that most Christians tune out of. I don't want to get into that. That's politics. We're waiting for our Jesus to come back. Hallelujah. It's all going to be... When he comes back, yes, he's coming to take hold of Satan and put him in that pit for 1,000 years as he rules and reigns. He's going to set up an administration in the city of Jerusalem. The place of his throne is a place known as the Temple Mount. When he sits on that throne and he begins to govern the nations of the world, he will rule over the nations of our world with a rod of iron. In other words, with authority. He will have to keep them in line. When he sits on Jerusalem, when he sits on the mountain in Jerusalem, in his palace, which is interestingly the Hebrew word, one of the Hebrew words for the word temple, when he sits there on that mountain, and he looks out over the nations of the world, many of those nations will no longer be in existence. Those that survive the war that he's coming to fight against them will have to come up to Jerusalem every year, send representatives to Jerusalem every year to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. If they don't, their lands will not get rain. They will go into drought. His governance is coming. The king is coming. And for those of us who are in his kingdom, we will rule and reign with him, and it's going to be glorious. But we're not going to sit in parks under willow trees strumming harps. That's not what lies ahead, ladies and gentlemen. There's government. The government will be upon his shoulders. The Prince of Peace is coming to set up his kingdom. And we are invited to be a part of that, both individually, but also as nations. Because some nations will survive. There will be some that still exist. So what am I talking about? Where is this guy coming from? Mars? On Thursday afternoon at 12:30. Now, first of all, let me quickly go into my background so you understand who I am and who I'm not. I have some Australian blood. My father's maternal great-grandmother came from Adelaide. She married a man from the North Island of New Zealand, so I have a bit of Kiwi blood in me as well. In the other line, missionaries from America, from the United States, settled in South Africa. Excuse me. And that's my bloodline goes back through the United States via the Mayflower to England. I was born in the mission field. I'm Gentile from top to bottom. I've done the spitting test. No, I haven't. But I don't believe I have any. I don't believe I have any Jewish blood in my veins. It doesn't trouble me. I'm not. I don't feel disadvantaged. I have the blood of the Lamb. I don't need any other blood. I'm South African. I've lived in Israel for 30 years. I went to Israel with a backpack. Still have the backpack. But I also have a wife and 7 kids born to me in Israel, in Jerusalem. Gentiles. My wife is Gentile. She's Czech. Her name is Francesca. She's from Prague. Our 7 children are Gentiles. That means that they're not recognized in Israel as citizens, even though they were born there. About 14 months ago, 3 of my children became full citizens of the state of Israel. So I'm a Gentile South African with Israeli children. Next month, my oldest son, Joseph, is getting married to a Jewish girl named Ruth, which according to Jewish law means that I'm a Gentile South African with Israeli children who will soon have Jewish grandchildren. I think that's how it goes. Okay. I'm not Australian and I'm not Israeli. But on Thursday, I will be bringing a presentation in the federal parliament to some of your lawmakers concerning the question of Jerusalem. Let me just preempt this with a couple of thoughts about why I've come, and there's a bit of a history. When I came and we first met Greg, it wasn't my first visit here. I came down here for the first time in 2016. I came here in response to the words of that mayor in Beersheba to the ambassador from Australia. If it wasn't for Australia, there would be no Israel. At that point, nations were lining up and competing with one another to recognize a state called Palestine. A state called Palestine. I'm a tour guide, and when I take people around Israel, and please come and let me guide you around. I don't guide Disneyland, I guide God's land. It's an amazing, your faith, once you've been there, your faith will never be the same again. The horizons of your understanding of what God is doing will be blown out of beyond your imagination. It will deepen, it will root you, it will excite you, it will galvanize you. Come and see, come walk where Jesus walked, come see the land where he was, which is also the land to which he's coming back. Come and see what's being prepared, the stage that's being prepared for the coming of our King. Yes, come if you can. And if you think you can't, ask him. Tell him, Lord, I'd like to see your land. So when I guide people around Israel after a few days, they often say to me, well, we've seen Israel, now can we please see Palestine? And I say to them, sorry, there's no such place. And they say, oh, yes, there is. And I say, well, there isn't. Oh, yes, there is. No, there isn't. Back and forth a little bit. And then they say, listen. They get exasperated. They say, listen. Everyone knows there's a Palestine. 136 member states in the United Nations have recognized the state of Palestine. The news talks about Israel/Palestine. Everyone talks about Israel/Palestine. I don't know if you heard, but an election that took place recently in the month of May. There was a political party in some country where kangaroos hop around with, which was saying, when we win the election, are we going to recognize Palestine? There is obviously a Palestine. Everybody says there's a Palestine. Well, that doesn't matter. Everybody says there's a Palestine. Everybody said that the emperor's clothes were beautiful, but he was stark naked. Doesn't matter. There is no state called Palestine, neither has there ever been, and in my understanding, there never will be. So what is this? What's happening? Why in 2016 are nations recognizing Palestine? And why am I concerned about Australia's role? Because I've understood since I moved to Israel as a journalist covering the relationships between nations, primarily the United States and Europe, on the one hand, and Israel on the other, that nations have an enormously important part to play in Israel's modern-day existence, the fact that it does exist, and that the nations of the world are increasingly in danger of coming against and finding themselves fighting against the plans and purposes of God for that nation. Australia had, as I began to learn, had been very positively, gloriously used in a way to bring blessing by preparing the way for the kingdom of God. Your 800 light horse men that charged at Beersheba were preparing the way for the coming of the kingdom. Get this. Don't do what Gentiles do. What we Gentiles do, we Greeks, our Greek thinking, we separate the spiritual from the secular. There's no separation. God works through nations, he works in wars, he works through presidents and prime ministers. That's God's work, and it's all leading in one direction, and that's to the coming of the king. What's happening in that realm is as much as important concerning our eternal future, our destiny, as you're gathering in this place this morning, and the life groups you're setting up, and everything else. It's not something on the side. Get this. And if you don't get it, then go to God. That's I think I said that at the beginning. That's my heart's desire. Go and ask the Holy Spirit, what are you saying? What is this? Is this you? Or is that guy wacko? Is he out there? Is this really something that we here on the Gold Coast, 14,000 kilometers away, should be involved with? Does it affect us? Will it affect us? Yes, it will affect you. It's affecting you already. You had such a close call on May 18th. So I came down here because I was concerned that Australia would be sucked into this deception. And I just felt driven by God to come and speak to Christians, not to politicians. I'm not an Australian. Why would they give me the time of day? But to believers across Australia. You are the salt of the earth. You are the salt of Australia. If Australia is rotting, if there's a smell of putrefaction in the air, if a country that 100 years ago was 80% or 90% Christian is today maybe 20% Christian, if men are marrying men and babies are being aborted right after delivery, I mean, if your country is sliding into darkness, then there is a stench here. There's a spiritual rot that's set in, and believe me, I'm not talking from a position. I'm not standing up on a soapbox and looking down on you. My country, South Africa, is even further down that dark road. But there is a war for the soul of Australia. And you can go out and, try and fight this war in whichever direction you think the enemy is coming from, and you do, because this is what happened leading up to, I'm jumping ahead of myself, but I did beg for like 4 hours, and I was told I can't have 4 hours. I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit, but I'm getting a sense that you're tracking with me. I hope I'm not losing you. So I came down initially because of the concern that Australia would recognize Palestine. While I was here, that process began. It was stopped. It was held back by the coalition, but it began to gain more and more support on the Labour Green side, if you like. And so, as I spoke to Christians around the country, I challenged you guys. I wasn't here in this church at that time, but I challenged Christians to stand on this book, the Book of Truth. We get our information about Israel from the news media. The news media is one great big liar. It is. It's one great big lie. Most journalists, and I'm a journalist, 97% of journalists are progressive liberals who have a perspective on the world and a perspective on Israel that is willing and prepared to deceive us about what's truth in Israel and create the fantasy, which is why there is widespread, almost universal belief that a place called Palestine exists. That's as a consequence of lies and misrepresentations in the media. We get our news and our information from the prince of the power of the air. And most of us, when we watch our TV, whatever, ABC, CNN, whatever it is, are not putting up a screen and saying, hang on a minute, this is a secular news source that's got a particular agenda here. They're talking about Israel. Do I believe that what they're saying is true? Because where they're coming from, what's their motive? We don't. We just listen and we swallow it and we are deceived by it. And so many Christians are deceived by it. And so they believe that there is a reality which is not there. The only real defense we have against a barrage of daily lies about Israel is this book. It's unshakable truth. And so the challenge put to Australian Christians at that point was stand up on the truth and proclaim it out loud. And around this country, a biblical statement was drawn up and signed by Christians across the United States saying this is our stand as Bible-believing Christians on the question of Israel. At the same time, a petition was signed which encouraged the then Abbott government to please not recognize the state of Palestine. That battle would continue, and there are all kinds of aspects I don't have time to get to right now. But up until now, there was no progress in that direction, but it did come very, very close. How many of you have heard of a rather strange and unique individual by the name of Donald Trump? I know you're far away from that situation too, but I think everybody followed his election campaign. As he ran for the presidency of the most powerful nation on earth, with nearly 400 million people in it, and all the issues that he had to deal with, right at the beginning of his campaign, he stood up and he said, if I become president of the United States, I will recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and put my embassy there. And logical, sensible people would have said, well, what the heck? No, whatever. What are you talking about? You've got China, you've got Putin, you've got stuff happening. You've got a massive country. You're talking about a little tiny land and a city that's not really relevant. Why are you bringing this into the election campaign? The cynics and the never-Trumpers, as they've come to be called, parodied him and said, you're just trying to get the Jewish vote. But guess what? After he became president, he recognized Jerusalem as capital, and he moved the embassy there. How many of you have heard of Trump Heights? Anybody heard of Trump Heights? Trump Heights is a new town on the Golan Heights named after a certain gentleman called Donald Trump. Very soon in Jerusalem, there'll be a new train station opened up. It'll be at the end of the tram line that runs down to the Western Wall, as close as you can get to the Temple Mount, the holiest place for the Jewish people, the holiest place to God, actually. That new station is going to be named after Donald Trump. A coin was struck by religious Jews in Israel after Mr. Trump moved the embassy there with a likeness of Donald Trump's face and Cyrus's face. And Jewish Israelis said, that Donald Trump has prepared the way. Just as Cyrus said, go back and build a temple, Donald Trump has prepared the way for us to come and build our temple. That is some of the thinking that's happening over there, which is probably off the radar screen of most of you folk here. However, in October last year, out of the blue, in a place called Wentworth, where the former ambassador David Sharma was running in the by-election, a man called Scott Morrison began to talk about Jerusalem and an embassy move. Did that provoke a firestorm or what? So what led up to that and what happened? What's actually going on here? And why is it relevant to us? And where's it headed? In the run-up to that election, of course, you had Mr. Abbott was removed, and then Mr. Turnbull was removed, and then you had this incredible amount of instability taking place in the domestically politically. And I remember, because I was in the Parliament House when the spill happened that removed Malcolm from office, there was a lot of anger in the country directed against the coalition, specifically the Liberal Party. There was a lot of disappointment. The word disgust was being used, not by the left, but by more conservative thinking Australians, because it was chaos. It seemed to be chaos was at work. One prime minister was being spat out after another one was being spat out. And now here's Mr. Morrison in, and we've got to run for elections. Well, these guys who lead this party, they will be responsible for taking us into, or for us ending up under a Labour-led government. Now, please forgive me, ladies and gentlemen. I know I'm not Australian, and I'm speaking about your domestic politics. I'm not trying to step on any toes here. My position, sometimes they say, you're so close to the forest you cannot see the trees. You guys are close. This is your story. It's your story, and in the run-up to the May election, the issues that confronted you, the issues that you were concerned about, were issues here, close at home. Taxation, energy issues, climate change, all these different things that were like driving the media machine that was feeding into the election campaign. But from where we are in Israel, the Israeli government and Israelis, Jews, who look around the world and they see a world almost all the way around, almost universally, a world that hates Israel. Politically speaking, Israel is hated by almost every nation on earth. That's how they feel, and that's what manifests in the halls of the United Nations. If you don't know that, if you think I'm exaggerating, just go and do a hand count, just go do a count of how many condemnations are passed against Israel in the United Nations every year. More than against all other countries on earth combined. The United Nations singles out one country every year for a day of condemnation. And it's not North Korea, and it's not Iran, and it's not Russia, and it's not China. It's this little democracy in the Middle East. From their perspective, from their point of view, as they look out over the world, they see a world that is anti-Israel. They're pushing back against it. They're trying very hard to develop relationships and to use the I in Israel stands for innovation. 0.06% of the world's population wins something like 30% of the world's Nobel Prizes. If you have a cell phone, if you have a computer that's faster than the old dinosaurs we used to have, if you eat cherry tomatoes in your salads, if you go online, Google happy cows in Israel, and find out about how Israel's dairy farming brings double the amount of milk out of every cow every year than you get from an Australian cow. Go learn about Israel's innovation in agriculture, in medicine, in all kinds of technological fields. And in water, this little country offers its innovative gifts to the world. And under the leadership of the current Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, who yesterday became the longest-serving Prime Minister in Israel's history, they've been making efforts to forge relationships with nations around the world, based largely on what they can offer and what nations can get as a blessing from them. And Israel blesses many nations in many ways. Despite this, hostility grows, continues to grow, and its primary focus is against Israel, leveled against Israel's security. The creation of two states in that little land would be suicidal for Israel. We know that from history. That's not political propaganda, it's simple fact. So they feel alone, and they feel increasingly isolated, and they're looking around the world for friends, and they have a good mate down under. They know that. So what happened after what did Mr. Morrison say at Wentworth last year? He said, I'm prepared to think about, not do anything, just reevaluate Australian policy on Jerusalem. I'm prepared to think about moving the Australian embassy to Jerusalem. It was on December the 6th, 2 years ago, that Donald Trump said that he would move the American embassy to Jerusalem. The day before, in the Senate, in Canberra, a petition signed by thousands of Aussies from Elcho Island to Tasmania and everywhere in between was tabled, calling on the Australian government to move its embassy to Jerusalem. It was tabled and it disappeared. Nobody reported on it virtually. Nobody knows about it. I'm sure most of you in this room don't even know that it happened. It was the day before Mr. Trump said that that's what he was going to do. But there is movement in that direction. There is widespread support, also in the young movements in the Liberal Party and other parts of the country. Widespread support for Australia doing what's right and fair, because that's what it is, right and fair by Israel, recognizing Jerusalem as its capital. I wrote a letter. Well, let me just follow up with that, and then I'll bring myself to this. So Mr. Morrison made this allowed people to think that he would just give consideration to making this move. And the response was vicious right across the spectrum. And the cynics were out there as well, saying that he was just trying to help David Sharma get in, and everybody had a hissy fit, and people were saying, well, that's it. I mean, the man's blown it. Now we're really going to see the coalition basically shipwreck on May 18th at the elections. But as soon as he mentioned Jerusalem and the embassy, Israel sat up and began to focus on your election campaign, and waited for him to come out and say, well, what are you going to do about it? Because he said he'd release a statement before Christmas of last year. He did. He came out and he said something. He said, Australia will recognize West Jerusalem, and we will not move our embassy there. We'll leave that for the negotiation process that's continuing, called the two-state solution idea. There was a groan in Israel. Jerusalem has always been a united city. Go back to the earliest references to the city back in 3,700 years ago in antiquity. No matter who has controlled Jerusalem, whether it was in the Jebusite days or in the days of the Israelites, King David, or the sons of David, or when other empires ruled and swallowed up that land, Jerusalem was always a united city. In the days of Jesus, it was a single city. When the Crusaders went and turned that part of the world into the kingdom of Jerusalem, it was a single united city. It's never been a divided city. I wrote as much to Senator Erica Betts a few weeks ago, and I showed him the history of a city that has never been divided. And I said to him, Senator, your prime minister has just redivided Jerusalem. By recognizing West Jerusalem, he has perpetrated something which is an anomaly, which is an aberration. You see what happened with the creation of Israel, with Israel's birth in 1948, modern-day Israel. The city of Jerusalem was a battlefield which saw Jordan occupying the eastern half, illegally occupying the eastern half of the city. And in the Six-Day War of 1967, when Israel drove the Jordanians out and put the city back together again, that returned the city to its original, nearly 4,000-year-old status as a united single city. The Israeli government passed a law in 81 in the Knesset saying Jerusalem is the eternal and indivisible capital of the state of Israel. So that's one point. Another point is this. Under international law, every country has the right to choose its capital. Every country has the right. And under international law, every other country is supposed to recognize and honor that choice. So I sent some of your senators, I sent them a list of all of Israel's embassies and high commissions around the world. You've got dozens and dozens of them. Every single one of them is in the capital designated by the host country and has its embassy there. There was only one which I drew a highlighter through. One single exception, and that is Jerusalem. And it's not the only disputed city. I mean, those who say, oh, but it's disputed, and people are saying, no, it's not the only disputed city. There are other areas, there are other parts of this world where there is dispute over land and over the cities and over capitals. It doesn't matter. The country has the right to designate the city as its capital, and other countries are supposed to honor that. And why, I asked Senator Abbas, why is Australia making this one exception? To our shame as Christians, it was a non-Christian senator by the name of James Patterson, who in his maiden speech in March 2016 said, we need to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and we need to put our embassy there because it is the right thing to do. That's the only reason he gave. He didn't come with long arguments and historical documentation. He said it's the right thing to do, and he's absolutely right. It is the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do, and when the backlash that was directed against Mr. Morrison came after he said, well, we'll recognize West Jerusalem, over in Israel they said, oh no, our friend, Australia, has made a mistake. Please fix it. That's their message. The message of high high-ranking officials in the Netanyahu government to Australia, and to Mr. Morrison, especially since he now has become Prime Minister in his own right, in what he called himself a miraculous election victory. Fix it. It was a mistake. You tried to please both sides, you ended up pleasing neither side. Please fix this thing. There's something here you call giving everybody a fair go. Is that what you call it? Fair go? Every country on earth is recognized, it has the right and has its right on it, its choice on it, of capital city. And your embassies are there, but why not in Israel? Why not in Jerusalem? There is a postcard on your seat, some of you would have seen it. It said, "Let's get the embassy moving to Jerusalem," or something it says. This is the initiative of an Australian lady, put this together herself, and when she heard I was going around the country, she said, "Please take these with you," and she sent some on, and Joy Halen sent some around, calling for Christians who, in 2016 and 2017, signed onto a petition, pleaded with and asked the government, your government, not to recognize Palestine at the expense of Israel, not to go down that road, now asking them to come behind and pray that your country will not be one of those that injures itself against the immovable stone of Jerusalem. By trying to shift Jerusalem, by trying to make Jerusalem accommodate the political aspirations of a group of people that are actually Israel's enemies and whose purpose is to annihilate Israel, to wipe out the Jewish people, to remove them from all of the land, Australia aligns itself with an enemy of Israel who is opposing the purposes of God. And if you do that, instead of blessing Israel, you curse her. If you stand with Israel's enemies, you curse Israel. If you curse Israel, God will curse your country. It's not me saying that, it's him saying that. His word says it. It's the most foundational, original foundational biblical principle. And look through the whole list of history of nations, all the nations down through history. Every single one of them that has come against Israel has disappeared. And I would love to talk about one of the biggest empires and what it did. Its betrayal of the Jewish people and how it went from being an empire on which the sun never set to being an island today, which is of very little significance. But that has been the history of nations who have opposed Israel. Your nation stands almost alone. 100 years of mostly positive relationships with Jewish people and with Israel since it became state. There were a few blots on the copybook. There were some mistakes made, and there were some painful things done. But overall, for 100 years, since the charge of the Lighthouse at Beersheba, Australia has stood strongly with Israel, blessed Israel. More Holocaust survivors live in your country than anywhere else on earth except in Israel, per capita. Okay, and until recently, by the way, they felt that they were living in the lucky country. They felt that they were living in one of the safest places on earth. That's beginning to change. Yesterday, Mr. Morrison, fired both barrels at the media because of efforts to smear Josh. That's his name? Say again? Frydenberg, thank you. With some idea that maybe he's got dual citizenship and he has no right to be at Mr. Morrison's right hand. And your Prime Minister called it out for what it is. It's anti-Semitism. There's no justification for that attack, he said, and I looked at the argument he made and at what's being said, and I believe he's right. Last week, a Jewish woman in Melbourne found a swastika sprayed on the front of her facility there. When I speak in the synagogues in Melbourne, they have armed guards at the front door. I met a lady in Nambour a couple of nights ago who she said, we want to go to the synagogue in Brisbane, but they won't let us in there until we've had a full security clearance. There's a growing sense of unease here, and that's something that I think you should be aware of. Because how you treat the Jews in this land, how they feel in this country, will also obviously impact on how God sees Australia's treatment of his people. But certainly in the relationship with Israel as a nation, the national connection between the two has been positive and good and strong. And it's under attack. And it came down to the wire at the May 18 election when one party said, we're prepared to consider recognizing Jerusalem, and putting our embassy there. And the other party said, when we win, we will immediately recognize the state of Palestine, and we will reverse anything on Jerusalem that other party has done. Far away from you, a small land, an ancient city, becomes a major issue in your elections. I believe the Labour Party people went to bed that night celebrating. I think they were eating prawns and having massages, believing they had won. All the polls said they would win. All the pundits said that the other side would lose. I've seen that before in the United States. I've seen it in Israel repeatedly, where all the experts know who's going to win, and they all turn out to be not such experts after all. But I'm going to begin to wind this down here, but I want to just drive one more thing home. But it's not the electorate that chooses who sits in the Prime Minister's chair. God raises up leaders. And in the run-up to your election, I'm on the mailing list of numerous intercessory groups in your country, and I know there was a lot of fasting, intensive prayer for Australia and for the outcome of that election. When I was here a year ago, as things were beginning to crumble right after the spill, I met with some prayer leaders not far from Sydney, and I was trying to understand how they, as they lead Australians in prayer for your country, how they saw what was happening here. And I was listening to what they were saying. They were expressing great fear, consternation, uncertainty. It's going the wrong way, they were saying. What was once a Christian nation is virtually a non-Christian nation today. And if in the coming elections, as everybody says is going to happen, if the forces of progressive liberalism become the governing forces of this country, that's it for Australia. It's done. We're done for. That's how these men who send out prayer letters and say, please pray for our country, this is how they were feeling. And I pushed them against the wall with it. I said, hang on, are you telling me really? Do you really believe? And I cleared off a small coffee table in front of us. And I said, if this table here represents Australia, which a century ago was mostly a Christian country, in that framework, in that context. Today, what you're saying is that that Christianity has kind of shrunken, and the forces of secular humanism and sinful forces really have gained ground, and they're taking over our land. And we're standing at the edge of a precipice, and we're about to be knocked off. Are you telling me that Australia is that close to its spiritual demise? Is that how you really feel? And they said yes. And so I think that if what they were expressing reflects what was felt in other church leaderships around the country that they were communicating with and they were in touch with, then really the countdown to elections in May must have been a very tense time in the heart of many, many Christians in this land, which drove them to do what we're supposed to do, get on our faces before God. Somebody said it was a close call. I want to encourage you now that moment came, and that decision didn't go the wrong way, and a window of opportunity has been provided. There is a word that's been coming out of Jerusalem just over the last few weeks from a 24/7 center called Sukkot Hallel. Have you been there? Rick Ridings has been speaking about how God has impressed on him that he has opened a small window of opportunity for nations, as it were a last chance for nations to make the right choice concerning that ultimate question that God will deal with the nations about, which is Israel. And it looks like, from my vantage point and from my friends in Australia that I've spoken with, it looks like there's a sense that the May 18 election opened that window of opportunity, but it's very precarious, it's very uncertain where things could go in the next 3 years. When we fight spiritual battles and we see an answer to prayer, there is a temptation, I think, to say, okay, we won that one, let's go fishing or surfing or something. But I think Australia is in a very critical battlefield right now, and a very, very intense moment in your national history. Now again, this is national history we're talking about here. The times of the Gentiles are winding down. The set time to favor Zion has come. 2,000 years ago, God turned his face away from Israel, and the Jewish people fell into the shadow of God's disfavor and of his judgment because of their unfaithfulness. And for 2,000 years, the Gentile nations have been receiving the light of the gospel, which went out with Paul and has gone almost all the way around the world, and Gentiles have come into the kingdom. The times of the Gentiles have seen Gentile domination of the land of Israel, Gentile control over Jerusalem, but also blessing as the gospel of the kingdom has gone all over the world, and all nations have come in. But that time is coming to an end. God is turning his face back to Zion. His light is rising again over that land, and our nations are falling into shadow. They are. And in the end, they will go into darkness. At the very end, they will go into darkness. And the only place where there will be light is where there is a church that is plugged into the light source, where God's face is shining over the land and the city to which he is sending his son. Arise, shine, for your light has come, God says to that land and to that city. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord is risen upon you. Darkness will cover the nations, and the gross darkness the peoples, but over you my light will shine. Our King is coming to Jerusalem. When he sits on his throne, if he sat there today, and he looked for emissaries to send to help rule the world as we will one day govern the world with him, there are only 2 embassies that he will see if he came today. There's only 2 countries that have their national governmental representatives in the city of Jerusalem. One is the United States, and the other is Ecuador. Ecuador is thinking of moving out, going back to Tel Aviv. And so one of the things that I'll be trying to impress, and please pray for me if you think about it, at 12:30 on Thursday, I'll be trying to communicate to your leadership, is that not only is this the right thing to do, but it's a very critical moment. If Australia were to make the move now, when Donald Trump moved his embassy there was a lot of fury, but that's died down. It's fact. The embassy's there. The only fury is coming from the world that hates Trump at the moment, but the embassy's there. But there's an election campaign next year in the United States, and they're already discussing among themselves, those who want to run for president next year, they're already discussing among themselves whether or not they'll remove their embassy from Jerusalem as well, put it back in Tel Aviv. Oh, there's one more thing I have to say. How many of you have heard of the great Southlands of the Holy Spirit? When De Queiroz made that prophetic statement, tell me, did he say Southland or Southlands? Plural, right. Okay, so get this if you can, and then take this to prayer, because I think God may have a strategy here. And if we think God has a strategy, then that's a good direction to pray into. God, is this what you're doing? Is this your will? Then come behind, we want to come behind it in prayer. We want to agree in prayer. Last week, I flew out of Europe. Out of Prague, where my wife comes from. And the day that I caught my plane, I got a phone call from a Christian leader in the Czech Republic. He said to me, Stan, yesterday Brussels, that's to say the European Union, they attempted to pass a resolution forbidding any country in Europe from moving their embassies to Jerusalem. This was last Thursday. They rolled out a resolution saying it is illegal for any European country to put its embassy in Jerusalem. They put it out there was a debate, and there was a vote. It had to be 100% agreed to. Otherwise, it wouldn't stand. 2 countries opposed. One was Czech Republic, and one was Hungary. So the resolution fell flat. So it didn't happen. Yes. Now, track with me a little bit. The Czech Republic is part of a 4-nation group called the Visegrad Group. It's Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and Poland. The Czech Republic is going to be chairman and president of that group in the coming months. And they are going to take a resolution which they have now circulated in their upper and lower house. And they have got more than a quarter of their senators and a quarter of their version of congressmen have signed on to it, calling for the immediate moving of the Czech embassy to Jerusalem. They're going to take that letter to the Visegrad Group, and they're going to say, Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, stand with us. Let's put our embassies together in Jerusalem. Let's do this thing together. Let's make this move. So this is something that's coming up there. Now down here, Well, there's been an incredible work of God out in the islands in the Pacific. A few weeks ago, or a couple of years ago, Samoa rewrote its constitution and declared itself to be a specifically Christian nation. It's right there in the constitution, the new constitution of Samoa. The Solomon Islands, Samoa, Vanuatu became the first country to recognize Jerusalem, preceding Donald Trump even, and Papua New Guinea. There is Christian faith at a government level there that is very pro-Israel. And there is a potential gateway for an Australian move on the embassy question, which if it did it in conjunction with 4 or 5 of the island states, would see the great south lands of the Holy Spirit, if you like, making this move together. There is an effort underway to bring that initiative to the ears and to discussion level in Canberra. And that will also be mentioned this week. At the end of the day, it's clear from His Word. Your country, your beautiful country, and it is beautiful. And I believe that I've seen more of it than many of you have. Because I've been around and around, and I'm going around again. I'm going down to Sydney tomorrow, and then I'm going all the way down to Tasmania, and then all the way up to the top end, and then coming around again. All the way around in circle to speak to congregations, to speak to groups, to encourage Aussie Christians to unite in prayer with the same intensity that many of you prayed for a specific result in the recent election. To unite in prayer behind your new Prime Minister, who happens to be a grafted-in, blood-bought Son of God himself, unabashedly, unashamedly, praising the Lord, just as many of you did so beautifully this morning. Come behind Him in prayer. You know, the pressures that a Prime Minister or a President come under from economic considerations, alliances, national pressures that are brought to bear when it comes to making controversial decisions, none as controversial as the issue of a relationship with Israel and Jerusalem. Mere mortals don't understand those kinds of pressures, and mere mortals cannot withstand them. Not Netanyahu, not Donald Trump, not Scott Morrison. It's not so important that you have a Prime Minister who is a believer. What's really important is that you stand around him as fellow believers and pray a wall of protection around him and pray that God will lead him in the right way to keep your country in God's blessing as you, Australia, bless Israel by withstanding every effort that would destroy her, and by strengthening her and doing the right thing, putting your embassy in the city of the great King, the city of Jerusalem. Amen? Amen. Thank you.